Okay, so we're joined by Thao Phan here from ANU to talk here about race by proxy. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
And if you want to learn more about her work, you can see here there's a couple of links and some books and journal articles and stuff like that. But just broadly, can we start off by you telling us what kind of research you do?
Hello everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'm a what's called a feminist science and technology studies researcher. So for those who aren't familiar, feminist science and technology studies, sometimes also called feminist STS or social studies of science, is a field of feminist research that looks at science and scientific knowledge as objects of study. So we ask things like what counts as scientific knowledge and why, who is given authority in these important knowledge making communities and who isn't, and what is the role of science and technology in the making of categories like gender, race, class, nation, and more.
Yeah,
My main interests as an STS researcher has been in using that kind of critical framework to understand, the vast array of systems, technologies, fields of practice, cultural figures that we bundle under the phrase artificial
yeah,
intelligence.
yeah. Okay, and that's kind of what we're talking about today. So, um, in particular, we're talking about a specific reading that we've set today. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about, can we start kind of broadly with, what the paper's broadly about, and then we'll kind of get into the more specifics in terms of how these technologies affect the category of race.
hmm So really, this paper was inspired by sort of some recent events happening online, mainly one that involved the platform Facebook. So Facebook got in trouble for allowing advertisers to buy ads and then targeting those ads at particular groups. And those groups were explicitly racialized. They used the phrase ethnic affinities, but we can understand it as a type of racial profiling because those groups were named things like African American, US Hispanic, Asian American. So
Mm.
you could buy an ad for like housing or scholarships and say, show this ad to African American, Asian American, US Hispanics, and so on. But they got in trouble because you could not only buy ads to target, you could also ask to exclude. So you could buy an ad for like housing and say, do not show this to
Yeah.
African American, US Hispanic, Asian American, and so on. Um, um, what is in many cases like a clear violation of sort of racial discrimination law.
Mhm.
For me, what's super interesting is the way that they determined race to do that. So a platform like Facebook doesn't ask you to racially categorize yourself according to race. They infer your race
Yeah.
based on your behavioral data.
Yeah.
And they use proxy indicators to do that. So they'll use things like IP address, language, people in your network, things you click on, and so on to determine and make a sort of like a guess of what your racial classification should be.
Yeah. And throughout the course, both before this point and after, we're looking at aspects of that as well in terms of other things that are probably making up that data self or data doppelganger or what I've been calling data zombie.
Mhm.
Is like music tastes, all this kind of your Spotify stuff is increasingly enrolled into the way that these things are profiling us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all, I mean, the big thing for us is that we actually don't always know what
Mm.
those proxies are.
Yeah,
And I'm sure we'll chat about it in just a minute. So we have a sense of what data they might be using, but not a full sense.
yeah,
And in many cases, because they're using sort of machine learning systems that are unsupervised, so sort of learning on their own and making determinations and seeing patterns on their own, we don't really have a process by which to audit and to make sense of that.
yeah. There's a whole black box aspect there, yeah, for sure. And the other thing that's interesting about this is not just the data about us; it's these profiles are made up about the data with our associations with others and other things and other institutions that isn't necessarily representative of us as individuals, but those associations become increasingly important, right? In terms of now making these categories of things like race and gender, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, one of the points we try to make in this work is that personalization actually isn't really just about you.
Mm.
It's about your relationship to people in your networks because that's how they sell things to advertisers. Like, a person like this is likely to click on something like this because somebody else they know has clicked on it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like this sort of statistical model of like the likelihood of someone to click on something. And that is just based on like, things that other people around you who are like you have clicked on.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So can you tell us how this is kind of how this transforms the category of race and transforms categories in general?
I mean, for race specifically, I mean, I'm really interested in how, in the long history of doing race, like this is a really weird and unusual way to do it.
Mm.
Right? So, if we think of race not just as a biological category, in specifically in social sciences, we don't often think of race through the lens of biology, and indeed, there's much research to suggest that it is not really a biological phenomena at all,
Yep.
but actually is more useful to us as like a social category. But that sort of how it's socially constructed is like done through the sciences sometimes.
Mm.
So, like, how have we historically determined what race is and how someone becomes racialized? Historically, we've often used things like physical markers,
Yep.
so phenotype or genotype, like sort of how someone looks or like what is going on under the skin and so on. Things like hair type, things like skin color, all these things become also markers of race.
Mhm.
What's interesting here is that we have a complete sort of dismissal of somatic markers of race,
Yep.
where everything is determined from behavioral patterns and nothing is traced back to the body.
Yep. 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 Okay. Yeah, and that is a fundamental change to how races um, categorized. And it's interesting. It's happening at the same time though as the kind of return of those overt physical kind of eugenic kind of things in mainstream politics. These things are kind of happening at the same time, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really ironic. It's like on the one hand, sort of like putting race in the bin in some stages. Because in marketing, for example, they're trying to say like the pros of personalization, the pros of using machine learning to determine and target ads is that
Mm.
you don't have to use on blunt demographic, you don't have to use these blunt demographics anymore. You don't
Yep.
just have to use age or location or like income or race. You can do really discrete, really granular forms of targeting. So
Mm.
you can, it's like say, I'm interested in people who like cupcake related content,
Yep.
or people who listen to this type of band, or
Yep.
people who do, they're trying to say like, actually all this data collection allows us to really narrow down on like what people should be. But ironically, that's all happening at the same time that like racial politics is
Mm.
like more in the imaginary than it's ever been and more crudely constituted
Yeah.
than it's ever been.
Yeah. And that very much relates to kind of the relationships between the kind of material and the digital here, that increasingly in the social sciences we, talk about being blurred, and it's not as useful to think about kind of IRL versus the digital because we're increasingly this kind of cyborg kind of existence. But we can see this in this notion of technological redlining, and I think it's particularly useful. And I think the imaginary of technological redlining might be useful throughout the rest of the course. So can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so I mean, redlining is a phrase that's borrowed from American social policy in particular, which is around housing segregation in US cities, in which specifically African Americans were redlined out of certain places to live in the city, like suburbs especially. And then so you get sort of the ghettoization of racialized groups in
Yeah.
that way. In the States, like very famously, it's like the white flight from the cities, and you get uh, the metropolitan areas, the cities themselves constituted as these highly racialized areas where African American folks, Hispanics, Asians, all other forms of like racialized others are allowed to live and not allowed to live in other places.
Yep.
The idea of technological redlining is sort of the updating of that into sort of the 21st century through the use of tools like algorithms and so on to determine like whether someone can live somewhere, who has access to what, to do this sort of resource allocation, but through these new tools and technologies.
Yep. And importantly, as we were talking about already, it's not necessarily done through these kind of racial categories. It's done through these more opaque, data assemblages.
Yes, exactly. But that often reproduce racialized categories.
Yep. Yep.
So, for example, one academic who's very famous for using the phrase technological redlining is Safiya Noble. And she has looked at how, categories like Black blackness are reproduced in very similar ways than they have been historically, because most of our algorithms are trained on historic data, right? So they reproduce sort of the same forms of discrimination and at scale, while purporting to be more objective and more scientifically based.
Yeah. But your point in this paper kind of moves beyond just the kind of garbage in, garbage out understanding, right? Can you say a little bit more, cause about that in the sense of the importance of moving beyond just the idea that the data's bad, therefore these systems produce bad, unequal, discriminatory results. What else do you say about that?
Yeah, so in this paper in particular, so the like kind of primary paradigm for thinking about like algorithms behaving badly, let's say, is
Yeah,
through, as you say, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like the worse the data, the worse the outcome. That like, if you have a data set that say, disproportionately shows that Black people are going to like recommit a crime, then if you train an algorithm on that data set, you'll have the exact same results. Like you're reproducing the exact same forms of racism. And the point we're trying to make in our article is like, actually, sometimes it doesn't just reproduce, it creates new forms
yeah,
and like constitutes race anew, and in ways that previously, that's not how they were done before. And maybe they look similar, may have similar effects, like that is racist effects.
yeah,
But it is worth paying attention to the very specific material nature of how these things are coming together, because it's sort of just assumed that, say, to fix these algorithms, we just have to do things like human in the loop. Like we just have to like bring in a person to double check things and everything will be well. As if the very problem wasn't the person, like a deeply racist system in the first place.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So you relate this to the work of very prominent cultural studies theorist Paul Gilroy. So can you tell us a little bit conceptually about what you mean by post-visual regimes here and how they relate to some of the, as you point out, kind of compelling but controversial claims that Gilroy made?
Yeah, so Paul Gilroy is a cultural studies scholar. He's based in the UK. He's part of like a very big cultural studies movement happening around sort of, I want to say, 70s, 80s. It's like Birmingham School of Cultural Studies with Stuart Hall and some of those folks. He's a Caribbean ancestry, and he's living and working in the UK. And he writes quite a lot on how we can be really obsessed with the idea of like racism constantly being reproduced, even in anti-racist discourse.
Yep.
Um, um, and like, what can we do as like serious anti-racist scholars, people invest in doing anti-racism to move ourselves like beyond being trapped in this like, always already fucked because of racism. Do
Yep.
you know what I mean?
Yep.
And he's sort of looking at developments in new technologies, specifically like MRIs and PET scans, and like how they visualize the body, and how they change sort of the scale of visualization, such that when you look at, certain bodies, well, you look at all bodies through that scale, like race suddenly disappears, right? Race no longer matters on these scales of resolution, like the micro scale anymore, because as we sort of previously mentioned, like on a biological level, there really isn't that much of a case for
Yep.
racial categorization.
Yep.
And he's sort of like, we can look to that as like a form of inspiration for doing our anti-racism, actually. That if we look across scales, and like through regimes that are no longer structured by certain forms of visuality, then we might find like the kernel of moving beyond like this discourse that traps us in like racism always, and like where is the in for us to talk about justice?
Right. Okay. Yep. Yep. And before we move on, I'd just like to also point out to students that like we talk also about the rise of, overt physical, biological racism that's returning to the public sphere and things like eugenics and stuff like that happening. I think Gilroy's concept of post-colonial melancholy is particularly useful for kind of thinking about that as well, if students are interested in looking for that. Okay, so yeah, can you tell us more about like what this kind of new regime of racialization and what it means to categories, how it relates to things like affinities?
Mm. So the phrase ethnic affinities is a phrase that was invented by Facebook. So they're very careful to say we don't do racial targeting,
Mm.
we don't do racial profiling, right? We allow our advertisers to target based on ethnic affinity, which is we're not saying that people belong in racial groups. We're just saying that their personalities resonate, have an affinity with
Yep.
certain kinds of racial
Yeah.
groups.
Their
Uh,
behavior on this platform resonates with these categories.
resonates like you like Asian content sort of,
Yeah.
and you're good enough. And if you like Asian content, then you're good as Asian to us,
Mm. Yep.
right? And that's really sort of like, again, a very interesting way of doing race that is completely like the body comes second
Yep.
and actually preferences are first.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so I've highlighted a particular sentence there from the paper that to make racialized garbage, these systems need a lot of data gold. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes, I mean, this is getting at what are they using to determine these affinity categories.
Yeah.
Um, um, and by data gold, we mean like the right kind of proxies to
Mm.
put you into proximity with an ethnic affinity category.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about like forms of classification and categorization in the age of machine learning is that they're not necessarily binary, which is
Yeah.
often how we talk about like digital categorization, like you're either this or that, you're a one or you're a zero.
Yep.
But in the case of machine learning, like they do techniques around clustering.
Yep.
So it's like if you ever do like object recognition or facial recognition, you can see there are threshold values, right? Where they're just like, this is 75% you.
Mhm.
You look 25% like Tom Cruise. This thing is like, 35% a chair. So it's putting you in like a distance,
Yep.
proximity in nature to a category. And so it might say you were 95% in the African American affinity group,
Yep.
or you're in the 35% in the African
Yep.
American affinity group, and maybe you get served content based on that threshold value.
Yeah, yeah. So this relates to stuff we've been looking at early in the course around the person of the category and the category of the person, and the kind of the shift in kind of categorization in various industries from the kind of more insurance kind of model to the more kind of like the data-based kind of affinity model that we're talking about today. So I'm just pointing that out for the students as well. Yeah. Um, one of the things I've kind of been saying when I've been talking about this in various contexts is that I think most middle class white people haven't really given a shit about this kind of stuff in the past because they don't think it really affects them.
Yep.
It affects people in the lower end of the kind of discriminatory scale, those who are already being discriminated against and stuff like that. But what we know now is these ways of discriminating, these ways of regulating, disciplining, observing, are moving up the scale, right? They're happening in academia, they're happening in schools to like well-educated teachers and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting to me, like how I think people are increasingly starting to understand this is going on, but now that it's affecting them and it's becoming more of a public issue, I think over the past few years, because of relatively privileged white people are now experiencing this. And I've been speculating in the kind of week of work I've been doing on Spotify. I mean, it could be that like in the future, if you listen to heavy metal, you may not get a rental, right?
Yes.
You could mark that kind of Spotify data as thing that kind of ranks you lower in terms of being listed to be able to kind of get access to housing or stuff like that. So it's intriguing to me that like this kind of development is happening now across and further up the kind of class scale in particular, and I think that may be why we're hearing about it more in public.
Totally. I mean, we all have a stake in this,
Yeah,
not just because it could happen to us, but obviously because we should care what happens to others all the time.
that's
Like
true, but
we
unfortunately,
should
I
have
don't
a
think
we
that's what
should
happens. Yeah,
we should have a vested interest.
yeah, that's right.
But now what's unusual is that now we have the tools and techniques to do such systematic ranking at scale.
Mm,
To
yeah,
do
and I
to
mean,
everyone, actually, to not just to like some people in this particular category, but to um, anybody who uses these platforms. Now, these platforms have become sort of like the default modes through which public discourse is like undertaken and like
mm,
connecting with others and so like getting a job, but like it's hard to get one unless you have a LinkedIn profile.
yeah,
Enrolling in university, like you have to have an email address. You have to, and all universities are now subscribed to either Microsoft or Google. Like it's the sort of mm, ability to
it's
say no.
infrastructure. It's infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It's like, refusal is all very well and good at an individual level, but like when it's infrastructurally built in this way, it's actually inescapable for all of us.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So, um, yeah, can you tell us a little bit? Like, I was intrigued by this aspect of it because it's obviously, in a way, what this whole course is about. How can we study, what's not necessarily obvious and visible?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've already talked a bit about black boxes, black box societies.
Mm,
When I talk about black boxes, I'm referring to the idea of like there's two reasons why things are black box. Like one is that they are proprietary, right? So it's like for legal reasons, you can't disclose how this algorithm works because
yeah.
it's intellectual property. So say Google, for example, with the PageRank algorithm, it's like we don't give away how we actually formally do PageRank because if we did, then anybody could build their own
Mm,
search engine, and that's like undermining our enterprise. And then another reason why things become black boxed is because of like the sheer technical complexity of how these things work.
yeah.
I mentioned previously unsupervised machine learning. There are two types of machine learning usually, supervised and unsupervised. Supervised is when you like have a big data set and you like step the machine, the model through, like, this is what I want you to find, and this is
Mm,
how I think you should do it, and just reproduce that in a different way and at scale. And they're like, great, that goes off and does that. Unsupervised is when you just like give a model like a huge data set and just like go off and do your thing.
yeah.
And then we'll, as long as the results look good to us, great. We don't
Yeah.
need to necessarily know what happened in between.
Mhm.
And so that poses a real issue for researchers when we're trying to do things like say, um, you miss out, like, how do we know you're being racially discriminated against now?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you can't see the model of which it operates, if all data is like live data feeding through, how do we get a snapshot of when something happened, how it happened, and
Mm.
how to prove like a discrimination case in this context? Like, how do you evidence any of this?
Yeah, you don't need a racist landlord anymore. You just have a machine to kind of exclude people that's kind of doing the same thing anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of that
And we
respectively.
can't prove that it's like based on racialized data.
Yeah.
It might just say, no, it was based on this piece of information or that piece of information, which like has nothing to do with your race.
Yeah.
But actually, in a settler colony, like everything is a proxy for race.
Yeah. Yes. And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit in the next one. So, okay. So we're moving to the point where we probably need to sum up. Just let me see what we've got here. Yep. So can you, yeah, just we've talked a little bit about these aspects of classification, and already we've talked about just about that in the previous slide in terms of the black boxing of that. Can we move to a little bit here about kind of what we can do about this kind of thing, maybe in the future, in terms of um, understanding this stuff and the politics of it?
Mm. Um,
Because you're pointing the paper towards, we need to kind of look at this stuff through a racial justice lens. It's not just kind of a research, here's some problems. We need to be able to actually do something about this.
yes, 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 I can see. Yeah, so I see, yeah, so there's how do we need to rethink what race is in this context, I
Mm,
suppose, is what we need to do. Like, how do we advocate against a process that operates beyond our perception, and how do we think about racial classification as a dynamic thing, which actually historically we haven't
yep.
done. So you think about like one drop rules, or sort of like in the States or in Australia with ways of thinking about miscegenation and so on, that it's like, what is Aboriginality in this context? It's like
Mm,
racially determined in terms of ancestry. And so, which is not dynamic. It's like, you're always a part of these groups.
yep.
But now we have a new way of doing race. And how do we account for that? I
Mm,
mean, in the toolkit of like anti-racist like justice, like we've often turned to things like representation, for example, as like a cure for like there's not enough people on the board making decisions who are people of color, so we need more people on the board. But
yep.
like, what does that mean in this context, actually? Like,
Mm,
do we need more
mm,
more training data on racialized people? Like, that's not good either. That's not like, there's not a really ethical way to like take account of that data and to gather that data and to make data sets about people. These are not good solutions necessarily.
yep. Yep.
And then how do you form communities of solidarity under these conditions? Because historically, when again, how does racial justice come about? Well, it's like people seeing and creating communities of solidarity with others who are suffering under the same conditions and being advocate for themselves. But if we can't even see how we're being classified, how others being classified, how we're being put into relation to each other, we can't evidence what's happening. How do we do any of that stuff?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. And some theorists have got ideas about this, how maybe we'll be able to organize around our various scores of things like that, and it could bring disparate groups together, you know. But like, yeah, I find some of that a little bit idealistic at the moment. Yeah. Okay, I am going to ask you to sum up and what you think is going to happen in the future about these topics, but I might do that now at the end of the next talk we have and stop this one here. Okay, thanks, and I'll be back talking with Tao in a second.